CMMC assessments are here. So 'tis the season. And we're going to talk today about the final rule and how that impacts the defense industrial base contractors and such. And we're joined by two very qualified presenters in our panel today. First, I'll introduce Noelle Vestal, who's compliance officer at Prevail, and she heads up all things compliance here and is the creator of Prevail's Compliance Accelerator program. And we also have Tom Tollerton, who's the principal and CMMC practice lead at Forvis Mazars. They are an authorized C3PAO and experts in readiness, consulting, and all assessment-related activities as well. So two really good perspectives here today. And my name's Greg LaRoche. I head up product at Prevail. And thanks everyone again for joining. So what has happened and why do we want to have a webinar? Well, basically, the final rule is here. We've talked about it for a long time. Some of us for many years. Those of us who have been in this market as long as I have. We've been tracking this topic for, almost 6 years now. And well, it's here. So for those of you who didn't get a piece of cake, CMMC's birthday was yesterday. And so what does that mean? That means CMMC assessment process document has released, otherwise known as the CAP. And the C3PAO assessments can begin January 2nd, as we are informed. So we have a timeline that represents that. And we would take the next 30 to 45 minutes to discuss what this means to the defense industrial base contractor community from the perspective of our two highly qualified panelists. So let's start with that. And we're going to start with Tom. And we're going to start off with some kind of basic questions on the timeline and what's going on with the mechanics of the new rule. And then we'll move from there into, what are we going to do with this information, right? So Tom, CMMC assessments can start now. So
yes,
what does this mean? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here. I love the title of the webinar, Hold On. I've been saying Merry CMMC Day since Monday, but I think it's actually Happy CMMC Day now that it's officially here. But it's that time of season, I suppose. But yes, December 16th, which was Monday, the 32 CFR Part 170 rule did go into effect. That was published as final back in October. And effectively what that did, we won't get too deep into it, but it has formally established the CMMC initiative as the CMMC ecosystem, the rollout schedule, the levels. There's talk here in a second about the 48 CFR rule, which will actually put CMMC into force for acquisitions and allow contracting officers to require it as part of their acquisitions. But effectively, December 16th, the rule is enforced. The Cyber AB, the third party that manages the CMMC ecosystem, the C3PAOs and assessors, has stipulated in their CAP that C3PAOs can start those CMMC level 2 assessments on a voluntary basis starting January 2nd, as you said, Greg. And effectively, what's going on right now between the 16th and January 2nd is the Cyber AB is getting all the C3PAOs organized and reauthorized in a lot of situations. As defined in the rule, there's a lot of expectation as far as the ability to use EMAS and submit the results, the findings of an assessment, as well as earlier requirements for things like intake and scoping documentation. So there's a lot of focus now on let's make sure all the C3PAOs are doing the same thing, are ready to go at the same time, and consistently execute these assessments. And then, you have, I think we'll discuss a little bit more detail here in a minute, but the 48 CFR rule, as I mentioned, is expected next year, which will put CMMC as a requirement into certain solicitations and certain contract RFPs, not all of them, but we'll start to see that roll out via 4 phases here coming up next year.
That is a great transition for our next slide, which goes into these 4 phases since you mentioned it. So Noelle, help us out with understanding, like phase 1 obviously is upon us, or nearly upon us. What's going on with phase 1 and the out phases, and how does this differ from the joint surveillance assessments we had last year? Focus a little bit on that, please.
Yeah, so phase 1, just exactly what Tom was saying. Once 48 CFR becomes effective, so just like CMMC came out, 60 days ago, but wasn't effective until yesterday, the 16th of December, it's the same sort of situation with a CFR 48. Whenever it comes out, there'll be a 60-day waiting period, and then there'll be an effective date. Whenever that effective date is when phase one, you see here, phase one implementation begins. So we've got the 2024, we've already done the December 16th, we're already through that. So just pretend 2024 is done at this point, it almost is anyway. So phase one is 2025. So let's say May 1st is the effective day for 48 CFR. As of May 1st, that means that CMMC can be put into contracts. Now, we know from the final rule that there's an estimate of about 135 contracts that will likely be a part of that, implementation in phase one. But something I like to always remind people, that's just the direct contracts. So there could be a ton of subcontracting organizations that come under those main contractors. And as another thing that was very clearly spelled out in the final rule is all tiers of subcontractors with access to CUI, CTI, any of that covered defense information, they will all be expected to have the same flow down of 7012 requirements of the NIST HERE 171/CMMC level 2 requirements. So that's something really important to remember. Even if you don't get one of those direct contracts, you're like, oh, I'm great. Well, what if you're supplying to one of them? So it's something to be aware of. That will last for 1 year. And during that 1 year, people will continue with their self-attestations for level 1 and level 2 as they've been doing. That's something that's been going on for a while now. They'll continue that. You'll not be required to get a third-party attestation unless for some reason there's something in your contract about that. We don't expect that to happen, but it could. Otherwise, you will not be expected to get a third-party assessment until phase 2, which you see is in 2026. So let's say that CFR 48 went live on May 1st, 2025. Then that would mean on May 1st, 2026, that would be the end of that year. And then May 2nd of 2026 is when phase 2 starts. Phase 2 is when you're going to have those requirements to get those third-party assessments done for level 2. There's going to be more contracts. I think it's somewhere in the 500 and something range in phase 2. Phase 3 will come out a year after that. You're seeing a trend here. Phase 3 will come out a year after phase 2 ends. Phase 3 is going to be even more implementation and contracts, with the end of phase 4 being really the full implementation during that last year in 2028 of all the different DoD contracts who do have CUI interaction will be expected to be level 2 CMMC certified. And that's externally certified. So it's something to remember. How does this different from the joint surveillance voluntary assessments that we've had for the past, year and change? So last August is when they started the joint surveillance voluntary assessments. Those were with the DIBCAC, which is the DoD's assessment branch. So the DIBCAC would work with C3PAOs, like, for example, Tom at Forvis. They would work together with those C3PAOs to schedule time for those organizations who are seeking certifications to get an assessment done. The difference, of course, is that the DIBCAC is no longer going to be involved now. When C3PAOs start doing their assessments on January 2nd, it's just C3PAOs. There's no DIBCAC involvement now. There's none of that DoD oversight because really they've already done all of that for the past, 14, 15 months. So that's where the difference comes in. Another big difference between the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program and your actual implementation of CMMC is that in the Joint Surveillance Voluntary Assessment Program, pretty much anything could be a POAM item, meaning something that you could deal with later. And you were given 6 months, like, hey, I have a 12 out of 110. I have 6 months to fix everything. Yay, that's great. That is not how it works when you do an actual C3PAO assessment. C3PAO assessments are now going to have the 88 out of 110 as a required minimum score in order to even have anything listed for a POAM later on. And be very conscientious about that. I warn people all the time. Limited deficiencies are up to the lead assessor and the C3PAO to decide whether or not you even get to do that. You may not be able to be a part of that program. So always strive to get 110. But again, it's much more stringent and it's much more strenuous than the JSVAs were because of the fact that you don't have the POAM anything option.
Yeah, and I'll add here as we look at this timeline. Noah, you did a great job kind of laying out the 4 phases and how the rules simplified a little bit. We had a 6-month transition here, an 18-month transition there. In the proposed rule, they just made everything a 12-month. Each phase 12 months. But it is important to note too, in the phase 1, where you talked about the continued self-assessment expectation, there isn't a requirement yet until 2026. Now there is the expectation that you would have that perfect score. You could have that imperfect score and submit it to DIBCAC. That was the DFAR 7012 clause expectation. But now the expectation is for that CMMC certification, you would have a 110 score. So it's sort of that all or nothing requirement, even now in the phase 1 with the 32 CFR rule.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And thank you for clarifying that, Tom. So again, I've had this conversation with multiple different people who are like, oh, well, I'll just strive for 88 out of 110. That'll be fine. Please don't do that. Please do not strive for 88. Strive for the 110 because truly, when I say, I mean, to Tom's point, you're expected to do that, from a self-assessment standpoint anyway. When you get a third party assessed, if you are not even close to that 88, you've basically just wasted your money. You're not even going to get close. And then if you do the 88, there's very specific rules and regulations around what you can poem, what you can't, how long. There's all kinds of different things. So I really want to make sure that we make this very clear. Please do not strive for an 88, strive for 110.
Excellent notes. Thanks both. All right. So we've talked a lot about kind of the mechanics of the rollout and the rule and the dates and such things. And that's really important. People are all very curious about that. But now I'm going to turn the tables a little bit and say, like, okay, now what? So I could play devil's advocate and say here, well, wait a minute. It says, you just said phase 2 doesn't start till 2026. Why do I have to worry about this in 2025 in that case? And so I'm going to turn that over to Tom to start with. So do we have extra time here? Is this a big runway now? Can I just take a year off? What do I do as a contractor? How should I think about this?
Contractors should certainly meet that 110 score, as Noel outlined. You do, because of where we are with the ecosystem right now, with, I think it's still 62, it might be 63 C3PAOs. There's expected to be a lot of bottleneck in the ability to get an assessor. And frankly, even beyond just the C3PAOs, CMMC certified assessors as individuals are even harder to come by in the marketplace because there are fairly stringent requirements to become an assessor, and even then a lead assessor. There is a tier 3 suitability determination background check, so to speak, that has to happen. There are credentials that you have to have an experience. So it's fairly hard and rigorous to become a CCA, certainly at this point. So there's just that bottleneck in being able to undergo an assessment. And so the companies that we see right now that are trying to go through the, sort of the voluntary basis level 2 assessment, just want to get ahead of that. It is a 3-year certification life cycle. So companies that are knocking this out now, getting a C3PAO assessment now, don't have to worry about it in 2025 and 2026. They will have it done here early in 2025. Even though there is an affirmation that has to happen internally, you've gotten the C3PO part out of the way. And I think most C3POs will tell you we're starting to fill up our play card, so to speak, here starting Q1, Q2. And so the bottleneck continues to grow. We'll continue to see more C3POs added, I think, over time. But right now, the impetus is really, let's get this thing running. And there are companies that just want to get ahead of the potential bottleneck.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. What are some of the other reasons, Noel, why a company might want to get ahead of this as a great way to look at it? What advantages is there to being ready now or soon or next year, for example?
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a few of them. One of the big ones that we've seen definitely this year is an uptick in primes who are expecting their subcontractors to be compliant already. I mean, we're in 2024 and we've had primes who have come down to subcontractors that we work with who are like, hey, you've got to get this done in 6 months, or you have to get this done in 10 months, or whatever it is. So that's one big thing. These primes are probably going to start pushing down even harder next year because of exactly what Tom was just talking about. If I'm a prime, if I'm, a big prime and I've got a bunch of subcontractors that are working with me, those subcontractors not getting their certification is a liability now for me as the holder of the prime contract with the DoD, because I'm expected to flow down these requirements of 7012, which include NIST HARE 171, to all my subcontractors who are involved with CUI. So that's one way that you definitely we have had, like I said, a lot of different people who are getting pressure from their primes. And again, we expect that will just increase next year, not decrease. Then on top of that, those 135 contracts that I mentioned next year, maybe you're not one of those actual 135 contracts, but maybe you're one of the subcontractors under one of those 135 contracts that are going to have a CMMC requirement in phase 1. That's something that you're going to want to get ahead of as well. So there's a lot of different things that could happen that could make it where you're going to want to, accelerate this as much as possible. And again, to Tom's point, we are very much at a deficit of how many C3POs and CCAs that we have right now. The sooner that you can get involved in and get in the queue, the better off you're going to be. And also, just from a purely business advantage standpoint, if you have a CMMC certification and somebody else doesn't, that may be the deciding factor as to whether or not you get work.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Tom, Is this just new programs? Like, what kinds of contracts are going to start to have to comply with this new rule?
That's a great question. It is new contracts, and it will be, I think Noel outlined it, it will be a limited set up front and then phased in over time. There is the potential, I think we will see that, potentially contract extensions or addendums over the next couple of years. We will see. That's a sort of a legal thing that's out of my purview, but I would not count on waiting a long time. I would be, as we've kind of talked about a number of times here, considering that, hey, there might be a contract coming up that might include CMMC, we need to be getting ready for that moving forward.
We've talked a lot about C3PAOs and that DIBCAC was involved in the Joint Surveillance Program. Are they gone? Are they still around? What's their role as we continue to roll this out?
It's a great question. So, DIBCAC will remain responsible for assessing candidate C3PAOs. So you will have to bring a level 2 assessment under CMMC by DIBCAC, not by another C3PAO. And they will continue that process here moving forward. I can tell you that they are continuing to do their own voluntary DIBCAC high assessments of contractors at their discretion. We've kind of recently come across a scenario where we were planning on working with a client on an assessment, and DIBCAC has actually come up and said, hey, we want to do a DIBCAC high confidence assessment.
So so when we're talking about, and I didn't hear actually where you ended off at, Tom. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I think his main point was around how the contracts are going to over time include the requirement, and that
Definitely.
the assessors are going to have to be ready to support that. But also, I think, without putting words in his mouth, the thing that popped into my head when I was listening was, even if I'm self-assessing, I still have the same requirements, right?
Yeah.
And I still have to get ready. And so I think that's an important aspect of this, is that even if I want to plan for a C3PAO assessment in the future in my execution plan for compliance, I still have to be compliant, and I still have to self-assess and strive for that 110 score. So I think part of that is getting ready, I guess, is I think one of the points we were trying to get across.
And the thing to remember is that this is no different than it has been since December 31st, 2017. So there's a reason why the DIBCAC is doing these DIBCAC high assessments randomly and saying, hey, I want to make sure you're actually doing what you say you're doing, because of the fact that for all this time, there have been quite a few contractors who've gone, oh, yeah, I'm definitely 110 out of 110. Sure, certainly. Oh, yeah, whatever you say, and have done nothing, which is why CMMC started in the first place, to validate that everyone was doing what they've been expected to do for how many, 7 years now almost. So that's something else to remember too. This is still a legal requirement that you have. If you are a subcontractor or a prime who has a DFAR 7012 clause, you're already expected to be doing this, and you're already expected to actually have all this implemented. So that's another thing to remember, that again, those DIBCAC high assessments can happen anytime. And to Tom's point, we have an example of someone who was actually trying to get a CMMC assessment and still got dinged for a DIBCAC high. We have customers all the time who get, for whatever reason, a call from the DIBCAC saying, hey, we need a DIBCAC high assessment. So that's something to remember too, that during this time, yes, you're always expected to self-assess and you're expected to do all that, but also somebody could still come and knock on your door and ask if you're doing what you say you're doing. And not even just the DoD, but you can also, again, have that from your prime if you're a subcontractor, because that prime can ask you for whatever they want, an SSP, your policies, whatever it is that makes them feel like you're actually going to get that CMMC certification once you get it.
So that was great information from both of you. Thanks very much for that. So, we started off talking about, well, what's going on, what's happening, and then we talked a lot more about, the phasing and the implementation and some of the aspects of the timing and how imperative this is people work on it now. So what's the logical next question in my mind is, okay, well, now what? How do I get started? If I'm let's start with Tom. Say, like, if you had a DIB company, a contractor, they came to you guys and they said, we unfortunately did not get ahead of the ball here. We're really have done little to nothing on CMMC, and now we're catching up. We really have to scramble here. What would you suggest for a company like that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's important to be kind of honest with where you are. And It's important to recognize that it's not the IT administrator, it's not an IT manager's responsibility to just go figure it out and get compliant. It truly is an organizational effort to get there. There are sometimes HR requirements, there might be marketing requirements. So it's important to say we're starting at ground zero. We need to do a baseline assessment to understand exactly where we are relative to the requirements. And even before that, there needs to be an effort to say, all right, do we have our arms around what CUI we have? Do we know what it is, how it comes into our environment, who has access to it, third parties that might have access to it or that we rely upon for compliance or for securing it? Do we have a full picture, the scope of an assessment, so to speak? So we always start there in our consulting engagements when we work with clients, is understanding, all right, where is the CUI and how is it handled? And then from there, you can start to do that gap assessment around, are we meeting the 110 requirements for protecting that CUI? That is the absolute foundation of where to get started. You might want to set a goal, so to speak, for, all right, we want to or need to be compliant by such and such a date, and then work backwards from that. But that's your absolute bottom line first step, is understanding the scope and then doing that gap assessment. Noelle, I'm sure you've got some additional thoughts as well.
Oh, that is spot on. I couldn't have said it better. No, absolutely. Scoping your assessment boundary. The only thing I'll add to that is I say this all the time. It is the single most important step you will take. It decides everything else after that. If you decide that you want to have your entire organization in scope, that means that every one of those devices, every one of those people, everywhere that CUI goes is going to be part of that boundary. If you decide to have an enclave, then that tinier enclave is going to be your boundary. If you have multiple different sites, that's included. That could be multiple different boundaries. These are the things that we have a lot of customers who ask those questions. Okay, well, I have the X and Y and Z, and where do I go? Take time in scoping that boundary. Especially if you're starting from absolutely nothing and you've never done any compliance at all, take time with that step. Go through the scoping guide for level 2. Make sure you understand the different asset categories and types. What is the difference between, a CUI asset or a contract risk managed asset or a specialized asset? And these are things that, unfortunately, with CMMC, this is very important to know. So I know there are probably plenty of people out there right now grumbling, I don't want to become a CMMC expert. And that's not what we're asking you to do. It's just getting an understanding. The scoping guide is relatively short. I definitely recommend everybody take a look at it if you haven't taken a look at it, because scoping is such an essential part of the rest of your compliance. And the other things to remember is that this is not a one and done situation. You're scoping a boundary that's going to be used over and over again for conceivably years, for even as long as you have DoD contracts possibly. So again, make sure that it's something that can be easily managed, something that the entire organization is on board with, and something that you think honestly just makes sense for the CUI flow and for your business practice.
Excellent. All right. So scoping is step 1. Boy, that sounds like we would benefit from a multi-step process for gaining compliance. How would
Yes.
we go about doing that?
You're right, Greg. It does sound like that. If only there were such a thing that existed somewhere. What Greg is alluding to is Prevail has something we call the Prevail Compliance Accelerator, where we have essentially a 10 steps. Now, granted, just so everybody's clear, it's not just 10 easy steps and you're done. These are 10 main steps with additional lots of little steps and tasks and that sort of thing. We sort of took information from all of our different customers who've been through assessments successfully, from partners like Forvis and other C3POs that we work with and CCAs that we work with, to build something that was a little bit more bite-sized, if you will. The biggest complaint we got from our customers was, I don't know where to start. What do I do? Okay, great. I've scoped my boundary. Now what am I supposed to do? I don't understand any of this stuff. So we made an entire program based on those 10 steps and made it as straightforward as we possibly could. So scoping your boundary, familiarizing yourself with NIST, understanding what a POAM is, how to create them, how to address those POAMs. Also, we even have a whole step dedicated to how do you find an assessor? What is the best way to find a C3PAO that you can work with and you think is going to be the best C3PAO for you to work with? So we also have additional just, extra steps of, hey, when do I know that I need a consultant? Tom was mentioning that there are consulting that Forvis does as well. There may be a point when you come into all this and you start looking at everything and you go, oh man, I can't do this. This is too much stuff. I need a professional to assist me. We have an entire course dedicated to that, asking yourself questions to see if maybe it is time for that. We have information about when we were talking about contractor and subcontractor relationships. We have a whole course dedicated to that as well, if there's some confusion there. So we definitely have tried to put as much information in there in as easy, digestible way as we can. I mean, we know compliance is a lot. Everybody on this call knows exactly how involved any sort of CMMC implementation can be. I myself have actually implemented the 110 controls. Obviously, Tom has it, 4 of us as well. It is not an easy thing, even for those of us who are experts at this. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible. And also on top of that, we're here to assist you too. So part of the 10 steps that we have in our accelerator is also access to myself and the rest of our compliance team to just, kind of give sanity checks and extra help. And we definitely are the ones who can tell you, hey, look, maybe it's time to talk to a Forvis, or maybe it's time to talk to a different consultant and get additional assistance, which I think is really advantageous for a lot of people too, because you don't know what you don't know, right? You don't know what questions to ask until you figure out that, man, there's a lot of information. And now you have the questions and you think, well, okay, I do need somebody professional come assist me.
Great. That's great comments for that, Noel. Thank you. And Tom, any of the kind of closing words on advice before we roll into the Q&A portion of our program?
We've been saying, I think, for a while now, now's the time to get started. I think the evidence is there. There's been a lot of question on, when is it going to happen? Is it really going to happen? Well, CMMC is here now, so now's the time to really be paying attention to this. And, I would just offer maybe a sense of comfort in this holiday season that, while it is a challenge, while it does require diligence, DoD is not out to get their supply chain or get anybody and point fingers, and they really just need to protect this information. And so they are not trying to make this, something that is too burdensome. They have listened to feedback. They want to make it something that's achievable at the same time, protecting the information that is sensitive to our country. So I would just make sure that the people that you engage with and work with are thinking from that perspective and not out to, make something, try and do a Cadillac when a Toyota will do, when what you really need to do is just protect the information. You don't need to be, have the super, most terrific compliance program ever. So I would just kind of offer that as a piece of counsel as well.
Great. Thanks so much for that. Right. So we did have our attendees did send some questions in advance, and we also are getting questions live through the Q&A panel.
Yeah.
And there's one that I get all the time that I want to ask you guys, because I hear this question from our customers all the time. It's like, I have the DFARS clauses in my contract or in my subcontract, but I don't get any CUI. What is my obligation? Like, what do I need to do? I have the clauses, but I don't get any CUI for my upstream customer. So what do I have to do there? And either of you can jump on these.
I'll let you take it, Tom, by all means.
Okay, I'll jump on it. Yeah, moving forward, the expectation will be if you do not have CUI, then there is no expectation for level 2 certification. And so there'll be, it won't be a perfect level 2 flow down all the way down the supply chain, but it is a point of sort of legal conversation and negotiation to make sure that that's clear, that you're not handling CUI, that there won't be any CUI that you handle. Now, the challenge is some contractors or some primes are going to assume they might have to give you CUI at some point or allow you to access it, or you might produce it, or however the relationship works. There's so many different examples, but, so some will stipulate, hey, if you want to work with us, you're going to need to have a level 2 certification. And so that can, certainly presents some challenges. And so it's going to very often come down to business decisions, down the supply chain, down to subcontractors.
And I would just add too that if you have a DFAR 7012 clause, from a legal standpoint, you are expected to do what is said in that clause. So that's the thing. Yeah, it's still a requirement. Even if you don't have CUI, you are still required to do that. It's very clear in DFAR 7012. You're still expected to do that. So to Tom's point, like, unless you have a conversation explicitly with your contracting officer or your prime or whomever and say, hey, listen, I need that removed, or no, we don't have CUI, and everybody agrees, you're still going to be held to that and could still be held to that from a legal standpoint. So that's a question that you should probably ask legal counsel to double check, because nobody on this call, to my knowledge, is a contract expert with the DoD. So I'm definitely not. Yeah. So I would say err on the side of caution with that, because from a legal standpoint, you signed a contract with a clause, right? And the clause clearly states that you need to do this. So again, be very careful about that and have those conversations with your cores, KOs, have legal counsel if you think that's a good idea, because to Tom's point, maybe you're not really getting CUI, maybe that doesn't actually apply to you. Well, then it's probably good to get that removed from the contract if you can, so you don't have those legal issues possibly.
Here's another one here that I also hear all the time. So I'm just trying to hit the ones that I hear frequently. So cage codes, right? I have several cage codes. I have several physical locations in my company, that kind of thing. How does assessment work for me? Does each cage code entity have to be assessed separately? Does it all get done together? That's a question I hear quite frequently.
Yeah, and the rule defines organization seeking assessment, and then there's also organization seeking certification. So effectively, it comes down to the cage code or cage codes. So the legal contract between a C3PAO and a contractor will be between legal entities, but you can have multiple cage codes for the scope of an assessment. It's just that has to be defined very clearly up front as part of intake, because that information goes into EMAS before an assessment even begins. So it's that can't change as part of the assessment. At least there doesn't seem to be a method for which it can change during an assessment at this point, but you can certainly have multiple cage codes per assessment.
And you can have multiple sites as well, just to, add that in there too. It just, like to Tom's point, you just have to make sure that's very clear, and that when you have that conversation with, a Forvis, that you're saying, hey, these are our cage codes, these are our different sites here, because again, it goes back to scoping that boundary.
Exactly. I was just going to say, and you'll want to make sure that everything that you defined for the assessment, the cage codes are included in the system security plan that the C3PAO will assess against. And so there might be multiple sites that have different physical security protections, for example, and the way they operate. You'll want to make sure those are clearly delineated in the system security plan so that the assessor knows what to expect when they start the assessment.
Definitely.
Another hot one here that I also hear quite a lot is marking. Who marks the CUI? And I'm in the supply chain and someone upstream, maybe they don't know what CUI is, and who decides and how does that work? And so I'm somewhere in the supply chain, and should I expect my CUI to be marked and identified so that I can protect it correctly?
That's a great question. And, that's a whole separate 3-hour webinar. We've got you.
Sorry. I was going to say, we'd be here for a while. Yeah.
Any contracting attorney, or at least the ones I speak with on CMMC, is that the DoD is responsible for defining and marking CUI, and it gets flowed down that way. Now, it doesn't always work that way, and even the Department of Defense and their agencies are not consistent about it. And sometimes there's overmarking, and so frankly, I don't want to say room for negotiation, but I frankly encourage pushback or questions and challenging some of the markings and some of the approaches to all of that. And I think the contract attorneys out there are certainly willing to help with that.
And there are going to be a lot of times, I get this question all the time too, Greg, of, well, I think I have CUI, but it's not marked as CUI. So like, is it CUI? Or I have this marking that this plan, this drawing plan that I'm going to make something, it's marked CUI. Is the thing that I make after the plan also CUI? So that's what's called derived CUI. And the answer to that second one is absolutely, that is still considered CUI. But from a CUI marking standpoint, when things aren't marked, which to your point, Tom, there's overmarking and there's undermarking. So we've got the situation across the board. The DoD has been pretty upfront about how they're struggling with this over the past decade, trying to get this together. It's as you can imagine, a massive undertaking, because there's so many pieces of information in the DoD that have to be correctly marked and all those things. What I always tell any customer that asks that question is, have a conversation with your core or your KO. Like, have that conversation with your government representative. Hey, it says here I have a 7012 clause. It says I'm going to have CUI. Tell me where that is. I know that there are ones that are marked. Are there any additional ones that I need to be worried about? What I usually recommend is, err on the side of caution. If you feel that what you have informationally by itself or in coordination with other information in support of a contract could conceivably cause, irreparable harm to United States national security should it get out of your hands, err on the side of caution and treat it as CUI, even if it's not marked that way. That would be that's just for me. I would personally rather err on the side of caution with that stuff. But again, to Tom's point, he's 100% right. If it's not marked CUI, from a legal standpoint, it's not considered CUI, since the DoD is the only authorizing official who can actually mark something CUI.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I don't want to open up too big a can of worms here, but during the joint...
Greg did that. He opened this.
I did. That's my fault. Yeah.
I might open it a little bit wider here. But just the expectation from DIVCAC during the JSVA assessments was that, even if it wasn't marked, you've done some level of due diligence on what Noel was just talking about. Have we looked at, hey, what are we producing here? What are we creating? What are we having access? Should this be marked, or should we consider this CUI? And then having the conversation about it, or making an internal business decision, risk decision. No, this doesn't meet the requirements, so we don't need to protect it as such. That's kind of been the expectation, because it just demonstrates that you're kind of following the intention of the CUI program and CMMC. So I just would certainly recommend some level of internal assessment.
Definitely.
All right. Yeah, those great questions. So I think next one is also one we get a lot. It's an interesting question because it is like, will the contract requirements have a look ahead aspect? Like, can I get a contract today that says I have to be CMMC certified by such and such a date? Because you could understand that's a logical question. I think the answer is no, but I want to get the answer from you guys too.
I'll jump in. I haven't heard about that or seen that from, or expect that from contracts themselves or RFP solicitations themselves. But I think Noel mentioned earlier that a lot of primes are already jumping on that and saying, we expect you to do this by such and such a date.
Yeah, I think the 48 CFR rule makes it pretty clear that compliance is required for contract award. So I don't know if a look ahead is even going to be possible under 48.
It's by award. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. But I thought that's also a question I've heard before.
No, that's a great question.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a good one. I know we get a lot of folks in the supply chain that are getting pressure from their prime. We know from an experience as a vendor what they're being asked to provide. But this question is coming in saying, what do I provide if I get asked to demonstrate my readiness by my prime contractor or by my upstream
I'll
customer?
be happy to take that one since we deal with this all the time.
Yeah.
It really, honestly, it truly depends on the prime contractor, but a consistent, well, at least a relatively consistent thing we're seeing is a security questionnaire. That security questionnaire can be anywhere from like 5 to 10 questions. We had one that was over 100, and they get very detailed or they're extremely high level, but most of them have some commonalities. One is, do you have a system security plan? That seems like a pretty basic one. I would hope that everybody has that system security plan. How do you secure CUI? Are you putting it into a Prevail? Are you putting it into some other sort of, whatever approved solution? They want to know about networking and training usually. Hey, how is your network segmented? Is it segmented? What are we doing? So a lot of it is in that scoping conversation. And then a lot of it is even a step beyond that of, hey, how are you documenting this? How are you training people? That's what we've seen pretty consistently across the board. There are some that are asking for a timeline. We've had multiple different customers who said, we get a security questionnaire and also, hey, you have X number of days or X number of months to get this done as well. That usually comes with that security questionnaire. But yeah, I think those are probably the big ones. And then I don't know, Greg, if you can think of any other ones that I didn't think of on those security questionnaires.
Yeah, it definitely covers it. And they're usually pretty specific about what they want.
Yeah.
They often send a questionnaire and you have to respond in kind.
Yeah, and you have like a certain number of days or whatever. And yeah, it's usually from the bigger primes, especially like these are, the 50,000 people and above kind of level primes. Those companies usually have a much more regimented way of doing it. The smaller ones, of course, have a little bit more, ad hoc, but they all pretty much ask the same things, varying levels of detail.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, along the line of what are primes trying to get away with? Here's another question. I'm not sure the answer myself, but they're basically saying they're seeing contracts that include a requirement that you must have an assessment scheduled in order to be selected as a supplier. Is that even legit? Is that allowed? Is that,
I have heard that that's happening, but I don't know if that is really, and now if you're talking about from a prime, I mean, that's different because remember, a prime to subcontractor contract is totally outside of the DoD purview, right? That is between the contractor and the subcontractor. That prime contractor could say, yep, I need you to get one scheduled. I need you to give me your SSP. I need you to, whatever. Like they could put whatever they really want from a standpoint of compliance and how they want that subcontractor to defend their, that saying, yes, we are 110. It's up to them how they want to do that. But outside of that, yeah, I don't know, Tom, I haven't heard of any DoD direct contracts that have that, but maybe it's something I doubt.
I haven't. I mean, contracts, solicitations, I think, are the expectations.
Sure.
So I would presume maybe the writer who asked the question was referring to those direct prime to sub contracts.
Yeah.
Be solicitations that would contain the CMMC clause at this point.
Right. And another thing to remember too is that a lot of RFPs, or RFIs, requests for proposal, requests for information, have CUI markings now. So that's another thing to always be conscientious of. I know that's a little bit outside of the purview of what we're talking about, but just be really conscientious because you're going to see that CUI labeling in a lot of random places that you wouldn't expect it.
So I think we have time for one more, and I'm just going to apologize in advance. It's another can of worms question, but it's compliant. We get a lot of questions. These are the meaty ones. We get a lot of questions about managed service providers and how they get scoped in. And there's been a change between the draft rule and the final rule in this area. So I think people would benefit from understanding, what does the MSP obligation, what does that look like when I select them as an OSC or as a company looking to be compliant? What does my MSP need to do, basically?
It's a great question. Yes, they did lighten the burden a little bit for MSPs. However, it doesn't necessarily carve them out of scope for an assessment. So really what we're starting to see is some MSPs that offer a particular service that's related to management of a CUI, of CUI or of a CUI environment, putting together kind of a shared resource or shared responsibility matrix, I should say, an SRM, where they've clearly delineated, all right, here's our responsibility and for meeting the requirements, and here's your responsibility as the customer, and then kind of pursue their own CM&C certification around that set of services and where they have requirements. And that follows kind of the payment card industry model a little bit with service providers having their own what they call attestation of compliance or AOC in that space. But that's kind of the easiest model. The other way you can do it is kind of pull them into an assessment scope and have them be questioned and have us take a look at the C3PO, take a look at their system and their responsibilities. It's not ideal, and a lot of them I would anticipate are not going to allow that or participate in that or want that, but it's a potential way to go about it as well.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to let that be the last word because we're wrapping up today's webinar. And also the questions we didn't get to, we will answer them and make sure we make those answers available to the attendees as well. So as we couldn't get to all our questions today, unfortunately. But again, I want to thank everyone who attended. I want to thank our distinguished panelists and wish everyone a happy holiday season. And with that, we will wrap it up.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.